Hello, welcome back to another episode on Space Door Live. We're here again with Nick and Terry with the Space Roundup. Hey, Nick and Terry, how are you guys doing?
Good, mate. Good to have you back.
Yeah, good to be back. Thanks for everyone for joining us. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, if you have any questions throughout the show, drop them in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed to our channels, hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, share us on social media, and let's continue building our space community here on Space Door Live. I'll hand over to Nick and Terry for another great show tonight to talk about the latest and greatest in space. Have a great show, guys.
Cheers. We've got loads to get through tonight, so we're gonna blitz through this one and keep it short and sweet. So if anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you want to ask us later on Twitter or whatever, please do. But we're going to kick off with our first story, which is probably the biggest news in space, although maybe it shouldn't be, and we'll come on to that. So Jeff Bezos is continuing with his suborbital hops using the New Shepard, named after Alan Shepard, obviously the first person to fly on the Mercury spacecraft in the early 1960s, first American astronaut in space. These suborbital hops, if you don't know what they are, basically it's an up and down flight. You go into space, you're in space for a few minutes, you float around for a few minutes, and then you come back down again. Unlike the orbital missions that SpaceX, etc., are doing, very similar to Virgin Galactic, what they're doing, but obviously Virgin Galactic aren't quite getting into what most people consider to be space, but it's another debate altogether. Anyway, so a few months ago, they had Wally Funk. Now, Wally Funk was one of the Mercury 13 women, phenomenal group of ladies who in the 1960s proved that they were every bit as good as all of the American male astronauts in terms of the training, etc., but they never got a chance to fly. So Jeff Bezos decided to put one of them, Wally Funk, who was 82 at the time, into a spacecraft. Now, the great thing about this is, it was fantastic PR from Bezos's perspective. He got Wally Funk up. Wally Funk's very highly respected, very revered by a lot of people, and it was great to see. And an octogenarian going into space, that was something else. Again, it proved that you didn't need to be this kind of test pilot mindset, mentality, physique, etc., that was almost de rigueur in the 60s. This has now been beaten by probably one of the most famous actors on the planet for anything to do with space, and that's William Shatner. Now, I don't need really to introduce William Shatner, but if you don't know who he is, Star Trek. Captain Kirk. He was the original Captain Kirk in Star Trek before J.J. Abrams and everyone else came along with reboots and reworkings and what have you. So William Shatner is now 90 years old, and after Star Trek, he did T.J. Hooker and a few other acting things. He's really famous for his music. He does phenomenally funny sing-alongs. Well worth a listen to. Anyway, so Shatner goes up on one of these 10-minute suborbital hops, comes back down, and again, this is phenomenal PR from Amazon. Now, let's not forget that Amazon are the largest company on Earth. Like, we're talking about and it alternates regularly, one of the two richest people on the planet is Jeff Bezos. The guy's worth hundreds of billions. His company's worth trillions. So putting these people on his flights, probably a drop in the ocean in terms of cost to him, is next to nothing. I mean, these flights cost on average about $10 million for the whole thing. The average cost for the people who go on them, these little 10-minute suborbital hops, is about £150,000. So putting him on this flight was a really good PR scoop. And to be fair, compared to Wally Funk, when Wally Funk came down, there was a lot of emotion, etc. But then since the flight, she said, wasn't all she expected, kind of thing. Shatner's come down and he was in tears. I mean, he said this was an absolutely profound experience. And don't forget, he's played a captain of a spacecraft for decades. However, the interesting thing then that came out from this, after the experience of him coming back down and talking to press, etc., was that the UK's Prince William. So this is basically second in line to the throne. Once the Queen passes away, we have Prince Charles, then Prince William, his son. So second in line to the throne, who has been instrumental in some very big environmentally related projects of late, the most famous being the Earthshot. If you've not heard about Earthshot, just Google it. It's really, really interesting and important project to try and develop ideas that will help the sustainability of the planet, things like clearing up the oceans, restoring the forests, etc., etc. The first Earthshot prize was a few days ago, and Prince William was there presenting it. Now, Prince William came out and basically was very critical of this, and there's been a lot of backlash over the whole billionaires in space tourism thing, whilst most people respect and understand the need for, innovation and development, I'm not saying all of this is bad, but as I said, there's been a huge backlash. There's a big backlash against Richard Branson with his Virgin Galactic stunts, and the fact that he deviated from the flight plan and caused all sorts of anomalies to trigger investigations now from the US authorities isn't a good thing. But Bezos has played it very clean, very safe, and he is doing great work in terms of the innovation. He's been a very strong supporter of the space sector in general, and is planning his own constellation, which that's a whole other, we talked about this many times. Prince William was kind of like, well, instead of sending like actors and millionaires, etc., into space, and don't forget, Bezos, this is a commercial venture for him. He needs to get a return on his investment. It's his money that he's put into the whole thing with Blue Origin and New Shepard and New Glenn to follow, and then possibly New Armstrong, etc. And the fact that he's also suing NASA at the moment, he's got a bit of a PR job to do right now, because he obviously got cut out of the lunar lander program. So he's got a bit of a PR job. Prince William saying, we need some of the world's greatest brains and minds fixed on trying to repair this planet and not trying to find the next place to go and live. So a lot of people kind of thought about this and thought, well, Prince William's right in many respects, in that we don't want to see billionaires going up into space and on these space jollies. And there's going to be about 200 to 300 more people who've booked on Jeff Bezos's flights and on Virgin Galactic who are going to be going up. And these people are all extremely rich people. Now, given the current situation of the planet and what's happening with climate change and post-pandemic, etc., this is not going down well. So interestingly then, William Shatner responded to this, and his response, whilst probably very well-meaning, was again quite explosive. I mean, he was then talking about, we've got all this technology, we've got the rockets, we should build a base in low Earth orbit, which we have. Obviously, the International Space Station is a prime example of this, and then send the power down here and catch it and use it there. So he's talking about satellites being able to beam solar power down to Earth, etc., which in itself isn't a bad idea. There's some real merits into commercialization of space, and real merits into the scientific exploitation of space if it can be put to good scientific use and good use, which will benefit all of us. But I think the ramifications of what's happened in the past week or so, not only with this, but the next story we're going to talk about, is has hired a lot of people. I don't know what you think about this, Terry, if the reaction's been the same in Ireland, but in the British press, it's been very mixed.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent from the point of view of just indicating how profound an experience it is. And if you think back to some of the iconic photos that came with the space program, the first photograph of the Earth as a complete planet, particularly the blue marble rising over the moon from the Apollo flights, that to a very large extent was responsible for kickstarting the environmental movement, because it let everybody see that we really are just a tiny little ball floating in space. This is planet A and there's no planet B, and we need to look after this one. And even though William Shatner didn't go into a full orbit, I actually would wonder what his reaction would have been if he'd been high enough up and long enough up to do a full orbit of the Earth. I imagine he would have been totally overcome. But the point I'm trying to make is going up into space and looking at the Earth from space, where there are no borders, no boundaries between countries. You see the Earth as one planet, and it's the only planet we have. And that actually is a very good way of getting across to the public just how important the environmental aspect is. And I think that the fact that Shatner, who, as Captain Kirk, was never fazed by anything, was actually sort of so emotionally involved and so emotionally affected by seeing the Earth from space, that actually was a very good thing. Now, it was a publicity stunt, and I just think it happened to be a particularly good one. And going on to what some of the other angles that we were talking about there, and sending power from Earth orbit down to the surface, there are other angles as well, such as mining the moon for helium-3, which would be a very, very powerful and clean power source for energy on the Earth. So I don't think we can confine ourselves to planet Earth. Certainly, there are lots of things that need to be done here. And I'm not so sure about Jeff Bezos going to Mars as a spare planet, if you like, but there's certainly an awful lot that can be done in the Earth-Moon system, which will benefit the whole planet.
I completely agree, and I think this has been brought across by several people, quite high-profile people in terms of the space sector on Twitter. And I, myself, and I know Cameron Porter and various other people have been talking about this. There's so many aspects that we need to get across to the public, the real benefits of space, and I don't think those are being put across in the right way. And this is the thing: Shatner's, emotional response was beautiful. It really was, great to see. And I think if we sent up more politicians, for example, and people who could actually make a change and have a real influence on the planet. You only have to look at what happened with Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was supposed to be a trip to the moon. It ended up being this is our Earth. They rounded the moon. They saw the Earthrise picture, as it were, and that sparked the entire environmental movement. So there's definitely something to come from this, but it's who you send up to really convey that. And if you send up YouTube stars and social media influencers, yes, but you're almost preaching, in some respects, you're preaching to the converted, because the younger generation, the Greta Thunberg generation, the followers of what's happening with the climate, the people who are really invested in climate change, much more so than possibly some of the older generation are in terms of reaction and response to it. I think that there's real mileage and traction here that could be gained. I don't know. It's interesting. Brings us on nicely to our next story, though, which is a totally different thing in space. So many of you may have heard that about a year or so ago, Tom Cruise, notable actor for the Mission Impossible movies and a guy who does his own stunts, and love him or hate him, you can't do anything but admire the fact that he does his own stunts. They are pretty drastic and remarkable stunts. If you've seen the last few Mission Impossible movies, the one where he's clinging onto the side of a plane that's taking off, and he's actually doing this. It is quite crazy. So he had this whole big plan with SpaceX and NASA to go up to the ISS, and he was going to be the first person to shoot a film in space. And there's been some small films made before, and obviously Chris Hadfield shot the video for his David Bowie tribute up there. But the Russians have beaten them to it, and it goes back again to the 1960s in the space race, where the Russians beat the Americans with Sputnik, and they beat the Americans with the first spacewalker, and all of these firsts, and the first female in space. So Yulia Peresild, I hope I've said that correctly, who's an actor, and the director, Klim Shipenko, they went up with a cosmonaut, Oleg Novitsky, in a Soyuz capsule, spent 12 days on the ISS. We didn't get a press conference from day one. Terry and I were just talking about this before we went on air, because most of the time, if you don't know, they don't really do press conferences on the first few hours of the first day that the astronauts arrive on the International Space Station because of space sickness. I mean, going back to the Rusty Schweickart days of Apollo 9, people get really, really sick, even if they practice with the Vomit Comet and everything else in low Earth orbit, in kind of the Earth's atmosphere. So it looks like they've now completed 12 days of successful filming, where some of the cosmonauts on the ISS, and don't forget the ISS is this gigantic structure relative to anything else that's ever been put into space. I mean, it's the size of a football pitch. So the Russian modules, they were quite happy to do the filming kind of in those areas, using the cosmonauts on board as extras in the film. And very little is known about this film, apart from it's called The Challenge. And having watched a lot of the Russian-made space films, things like Gagarin First in Space and Salyut 7, etc., they are exceptionally good movies. If you get one of the streaming services like Amazon Prime, Oh, the Irony, or Netflix, I think they're on those, and they are really, really good films. So I'm quite looking forward to this when it comes out. But this actor basically was sent up as a kind of medical rescue. That's all really anyone knows about the filming that went on there, and the fact that it's called The Challenge. They came down safely. They had a few technical issues getting there. They had a thruster issue and a docking issue when they were approaching the ISS, which is one thing. But they probably got a good deal. But at $75 million a pop, which is what the Russians used to charge the Americans for a Soyuz flight to the ISS. And they probably didn't charge them anywhere near this, but you're looking at $215 to $220 million worth of just getting them up there and down, never mind the film's budget. So I sincerely hope they got some really good footage, because you can't exactly do easy reshoots. Well, you could with current CG technology, and even in the Vomit Comet, you could get that out like the ISS, but Interesting one, and it's probably paving the way to more and more of these really commercially driven activities. You've got companies like Bigelow and others that want to put up space hotels and modules attached to the ISS, and there's a whole future of the ISS under consideration at the moment, with the Russians saying that they may pull out. And we've had leaks and all sorts of things. I mean, it's an aging space station now. So at some point in the not too distant future, it's either going to be decommissioned or somebody may take it over and use it for a hotel or other purposes. Who knows? Any thoughts on this one, Terry?
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting when this comes out to see actual zero gravity instead of simulated zero gravity. And of course, on Star Trek and just about every other science fiction film you can name, the gravity just is not an issue. You walk around just as if you're on the Earth. One other interesting thing about William Shatner in Star Trek, he wasn't actually the first Star Trek actor to go into space.
No.
Mae Jemison, who she had to retire from NASA actually before she was allowed to do it, but she appeared in one of the episodes of Star Trek Next Generation as Lieutenant Palmer. NASA have a rule that while you're an astronaut or while you're with NASA, you're not allowed to do anything like that, but she had retired. So she beat him to it. But anyway, yeah, it really will be good to see actual space footage in a fictional setting. Because, as I say, all the other stuff that you see, space is just not like that. Just about every scenario that you can imagine in a space science fiction film, there's something wrong with it in terms of the science. This, in terms of the zero gravity and how things actually happen up there, will be genuine, because unless they want to fake it and make it non-scientific. But yeah, I really look forward to it. And I hope Tom Cruise gets a good flight too, to be fair to him.
I mean, I'm sure what they'll do is much of like what they did in Apollo 13 when they filmed that, where obviously they used the vomit comet for the filming of Apollo 13 for some of the scenes where they did want to simulate a microgravity environment, and then intercut that with normal scenes in a normal studio where you'd have people like Tom Hanks standing on an apple box, for example, and rocking about. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of cuts like that. It'd be interesting to see how much of the ISS makes it into the final film footage, in terms of the actor floating around. You hear stories of you've got to be so careful just how you kind of move up, because you're just going to go straight up and bang your head on the top of the space station. So, and doesn't matter how much training the actor and the director had, they're not going to be as accomplished in terms of their astronautic training and capabilities as the cosmonauts and the astronauts that are on there. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it coming out. How fast Tom Cruise gets up there now, and if they beat them, very much doubt it, knowing the budgets and the timescales with Hollywood movies. So it's going to be one to watch out for. And it was quite a good story, actually. I like this one, which moves us on to our next story. Terry.
Yeah, Lucy. Lucy was named after originally nothing to do with Lucy in the Sky of Diamonds. Lucy was the fossil of what is believed to be the earliest hominid ancestor found in Ethiopia, and believed to be about 3.2 million years old. And since this mission is to look basically back to the birth of the solar system, the earliest pristine material that we can access, and say a bit more about that later, they decided that Lucy would be a good name for it. And then, of course, Lucy going up into the sky, and the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that was sort of an add-on, and they had a record, or I'm not sure what the medium was, but not a record and not vinyl, launching with it, and they will have diamonds as part actually of one of the experiments. So again, bringing the PR into it. But where is it going? The Trojan asteroids, a lot of you probably haven't heard of them. They are a group of basically captured asteroids in the orbit of Jupiter. They are in what are called the Lagrangian points. They're in the same orbit of Jupiter, but they precede it and follow it as it orbits around the sun in two groups, one ahead of Jupiter and another behind it, in the L4, Lagrange 4 and Lagrange 5 points. And they're clustered. They're not tightly clustered. They actually spread over quite a considerable area of space, but they are held there in a relatively stable gravitational resonance between Jupiter, the sun on that particular orbital position. And the reason they are so important is they are believed to be the pristine examples of the very earliest material that formed in the solar system and hasn't been essentially modified, a bit like meteorites, which we'll talk about later. So we know a fair bit about the origin of the solar system, or we think we do, about 4,567 million years old, and that figure comes from meteorites. Again, Nick will probably touch on that later. But when meteorites land on Earth, very, very rarely are they in absolutely pristine condition, simply because they have come down through our atmosphere and they've lain on the surface of the Earth for a considerable length of time. So to get absolutely pristine material that has not been affected by anything and is that old, they've decided that they're going to go out and sample some of these asteroids. Now, it's a very complex mission. It's on its way. It does a couple of gravity assists with the Earth to get extra energy to fly out to the orbit of Jupiter. It will pay a close pass around another ordinary main belt asteroid on the way, named after the paleontologist who discovered the Lucy fossil. That'll be a sort of a test of the system, and it will then head off to the L4 group. And I'm not going to name all the different asteroids and asteroid pairs, binary asteroids that we'll look at there. You can look that up on the internet if you want. It will spend a couple of years there doing relatively close passes. About 600 miles, I think, is the maximum distance that it will be passing by any of these asteroids. So it will look at the leading group, the L4 group. It will then do another dip back towards the Earth to get another gravity assist, and it will then head out to the L5 group, which are the ones that are trailing behind Jupiter. And it will then do, again, close passes of a number of those, imaging them, spectroscopy, all sorts of things which you can look up for more detail. So it's an important mission. We do have material from other parts of the solar system. There's obviously the samples that have come back from the moon. Again, we'll talk about that a bit more later, but they are not as they originally were when the solar system formed about 4.5 billion years ago. We'll get samples back from Mars, a lot more to come, we hope. And we have meteorites that come from Mars, but again, as I said, they are not uncontaminated from their encounter with the Earth. This will be studying these asteroids, and we're looking at material that really basically has not changed for 4.5 billion years. That's why that's so important. I'm sure you'd agree, Nick.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, being part of a team that discovered one of the Jupiter Trojans back in the Pholks telescope days, yeah, it is really exciting to be able to see these things up close. And so many of them are proving now to not just be asteroids. Some of them are proving to be captured cometary bodies as well. And we all know, obviously, with Jupiter, you know, its capture of Shoemaker-Levy 9, etc., what that can do. So it's really interesting. And my former colleagues that I worked with quite extensively for many years on Pholks, looking at these things. I mean, Ernesto Giovanni, who passed away sadly some years ago, we had a great time imaging these things. I mean, they were it was a fantastic hunting ground for us for these. So I'm very excited about seeing these things up close. And you only have to look at some of the returns from Voyager. You know, I was watching a fantastic documentary called The Farthest. If you've not seen it, please watch it. Which talks about the Voyager missions and the fact that once they got to Uranus, you know, Uranus itself as a planet was very dull, but then when they got to the moons, it was incredible to see the diversity and the shapes in the moons. And I'm sure we're going to get something similar to this with some of these Trojans, where you've got, you know, extreme fragmentation or, you know, bilobal. We just don't know what we're going to see. So really, really excited. I do love this story.
It's actually a long mission, 12 years, because it takes quite a long time to get out as far as Jupiter, particularly with the gravity assist. So in the late 2020s, it'll be at the L4 group. Then, as I said, comes back for an Earth gravity assist, and will then be studying the L5 group in the early 2030s. So these things do take an awful lot of planning and a lot of time to actually get the results, but it'll be worth it in the long run.
That's the thing. People don't appreciate orbital dynamics, and they think, "Oh, can't you just fire a rocket and send it there?" No, you can't. Ask the Beppe Colombo team, who know all about gravity assists and multiple flybys, and they're just trying to go into Mercury, and they're still not there yet. They've done a flyby of Mercury. They've not got into orbit yet. They've now got to do this, enormous loop around again to get back. So, if you want to get into orbital dynamics, it's a fascinating subject. It's extremely complex. So that's Deep Space Mission 1. Deep Space Mission 2 coming up as well, Terry.
Yeah, indeed. This is the thing that I am anticipating with terror and enormous anticipation. It is probably the most complex mission in terms of what actually all has to happen automatically that we have yet attempted. The James Webb Space Telescope is often regarded as the successor to the Hubble Space Telescope. Not quite. It will look at a completely different area of the spectrum in the infrared for a number of reasons. Basically because the further back you look in time, the more you need to look into the infrared because of the redshift that has occurred with the light that is coming from these very, very distant galaxies. Not go into too much detail on that. Also, the infrared can penetrate dust an awful lot better than invisible light. So you look into the center of dusty star-forming regions, centers of galaxies, and so on. Whole lot of reasons for this. It'll be absolutely fantastic if it actually all comes to fruition. Again, you'd need to sort of look up all the things that the JWST is planned to do. Now, to do that, it needs to get very far away from the Earth because the Earth actually radiates out into space at the frequencies that the JWST will be studying. It's actually an average temperature of about 30 degrees Celsius. So we want to go, or Celsius, yes, that we need to get well away from it. So it will go also to a Lagrange point, a stable point, the L2 point, well beyond the Earth. It needs to get out there, and it also needs to deploy a very, very complex sun shield to protect it from the radiation from the sun. So what you're looking at there does not look like a telescope at all. Basically, you can see part of the mirror there in the background, the octagonal shapes of the gold-coated mirror, but an awful lot of what you're looking at there is sun shield. So let's go back to what stage it's at now. It was constructed mainly in California. It has gone from California through the Panama Canal and across into the Atlantic Ocean. It has arrived at French Guiana, where it's on its way to the actual launch pad in Kourou in French Guiana. And it will be launched on Ariane 5 rocket. Rocket launches are risky in themselves, as we know. Things do fail, but assuming it gets into orbit and then starts on its way out to the L2 point, that is where what they call 30 days of terror begin, because of all the operations that have to happen automatically for it to function when it gets there. I mean, you could spend a whole couple of hours talking about this, but basically there are 40 major operations that have to deploy automatically one after the other for this thing to work. And some of them are so complex in themselves that it's absolutely mind-boggling. It has to deploy its solar panels. There are a whole lot of explosive boats that have to fire to release things. There are cables to unspool. There are joints that have to operate. There are electrical systems to operate, the antennae to point. And this sunshade of 7 layers, it all has to deploy. Otherwise, the telescope simply won't operate because the temperature will be too high. And just on that alone, there are 7,000 parts of that sun shield. There are 400 pulleys and 8 motors and numerous cables, and it all basically has to unfold like a giant origami to get the sun shield to deploy. Then you have the optics. The secondary mirror has to deploy into exactly the right configuration, and the main mirror, which is folded up at the moment because otherwise it wouldn't fit inside the rocket, it also has to deploy the panels. Basically, it's it's more or less shaped like a giant petal, basically, but the outer parts of the petal on opposite sides are folded in, and they have to unfold so that the mirror assumes its full 6.5 meter diameter. And after that, then there are about 30 actuators that have to align those individual panels of the mirror absolutely accurately to fraction of a diameter of a hair accuracy. Otherwise, this thing won't work. And the whole thing has to happen automatically over a period of 30 days. And of course, there'll be mid-course corrections to get it into exactly the right point when it arrives. And if any one of those fails, the whole thing basically fails. It's just as simple as that. And they talked about the 7 minutes of terror when the spacecraft were perishing down into Mars, onto the surface of Mars. At least that's over fairly quickly. This will be going on literally for 30 days, and I think there'll be an awful lot of fingernails that are bitten away down to the bone. I'm sure you're anticipating it as much as I am, Nick.
I have been for many years. So I was very fortunate to be invited to NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center some years ago, because I got involved after there was a plan by Congress to cancel the James Webb. And an astronomer, Heidi Hamill, gave a talk at the NEAF conference in New York, and I was there. And on the back of that, I came back and I got a UK journalist involved in this as well. And we set up a campaign called Save the James Webb, a team in America and myself. And I was the only Brit on the project. Oh, the only non-American on the project. Got invited over by none other than John Mather himself, who was like the PI on the project, and got to meet people like Amber Strawn as a result of that at Space Fest and other conferences, Maggie Mazzetti, various people who've worked at NASA Goddard for many years, incredible people. Got to see it in the kind of the build phases that were in some of the mirrors. The thing as well, Terry, that most people don't appreciate this, because it's so large, it's never been fully tested. It cannot be fully integration tested, because there isn't a vacuum chamber on the planet anywhere big enough to do this. I mean, the second largest one, or one of the largest ones in the world, is at Goddard. That's huge. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. You see it in the flesh and you think this is huge. Obviously, there's bigger ones at some of the other NASA centers, and they still aren't big enough for this thing. I mean, this is, you know, the test chambers that worked on Apollo that basically put the entire Apollo command and service module inside. It's still not big enough. This thing, the sun shield, is the size of a tennis court, and as you said, it's got to unfurl. And anyone who's used a telescope, especially a Newtonian telescope, which has got mirrors, or a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, will know all about something called collimation. Collimation is basically, if your mirrors aren't perfectly aligned, the image goes all wrong, and you'll get, instead of pinpoint stars, you get little fuzzy kind of taily comet-looking things. This thing has got to unfurl and collimate itself, as you said, down to micron-level precision after being launched on an Ariane 5. Now, if you've ever experienced a launch or know anything about launch testing, basically, to test something for launch, you have to do what's called TVAC and shake and bake testing. So you have to thermally cycle it, you have to expose it to radiation, but then you also have to basically blast it with vast amounts of sound, like huge acoustic resonance, and also shake it. Because when something's taken off into space, you may have been fooled by SpaceX's glorious launches, where it looks like they're almost taking a bus ride up into space. It's so neat. And Ariane 6, sorry, Ariane 5 as it will be this time, 6 isn't quite ready yet. Launching this thing, this is going to be shaking like a good one. And the fairing, which is basically where the spacecraft, where the James Webb itself is being contained, at the top of the rocket, there's so many things, that's got to separate on time. The orbital insertion's got to be correct, the orbital trajectories, the burns to get out to the Lagrange point have got to be correct. All of this, it's the most complex thing ever. And as Terry said, if it goes wrong, you can't fix it. Unlike the Hubble, which is only 400, 500 miles above us, it's still the furthest most humans have been since Apollo. But it's not that far above our heads, the Hubble Space Telescope, for the servicing missions. It was always designed to be serviced by humans. You can't get to L2 with current technology. There is no way this thing can be serviced, apart from possibly autonomously and robotically in the future. But it's only got a limited amount of coolant that's going to run out in a number of years. So this thing's got a finite lifespan, unlike the Hubble, where you could repair it and keep it going. The Hubble's now, 3 decades in. This thing doesn't have that lifespan. So, and at $8 billion, it's got to work. I mean, it's interesting. We talked about this before. You've got between the James Webb and very soon after, you've got the Orion and the Artemis missions to the moon. The Orion capsule is now basically being integrated into the SLS, the Space Launch System stack, which is going to be enormous. It's going to be practically the size of the Saturn V. That's $12 billion. If we take that and the James Webb, that's $20 billion. That's a lot of money. And if the SLS goes wrong, for God knows whatever reason, we hope it doesn't, if it blows up on the pad or something like that, and the James Webb fails, some people have even speculated that this could be not quite the end of NASA, but a really bad blow for them. So fingers crossed, please, everyone, fingers crossed that this thing, not only when it launches, but as Terry said, for several months afterwards, until it gets out there and it starts taking its first images. And don't forget what happened with the Hubble. The Hubble's first images were blurry, because Perkins-Elmer factored the mirror. The testing of the mirror was slightly out, and the machining of the mirror wasn't quite as precise. I mean, it's more precise than anything that had ever been built, but it still wasn't perfect, which it had to be. And with the Hubble, they had to put the CoStar on it and fix it with the corrective optics. There's no option here. If James Webb fails, it's gonna fail. So. Massive finger crossed. We've got a question. I was just going to go back to this. We've got a question in the chat in terms of imaging. So somebody said here, St. Alex, do you think any of Lucy's cameras could be usefully used to get data on the comet coming in 2031? So this is this enormous 300-kilometer wide comet, which we talked about in one of our previous shows. It's going to reach an orbit close to Saturn. Now, don't forget the Jupiter Trojans. It's at the orbit of Jupiter. So you're looking at you're looking at 500 million mile difference between the two distances, depending on the close approach on this comet. I don't think, based upon the imaging systems that will be on board, Lucy, that it's going to get anything meaningful. I think, however, James Webb will. So if James Webb is successful and is deployed and is still operational by the time this comet comes into the solar system, the imaging capabilities of the James Webb are so outstripping anything the Hubble can do. And don't forget, by that time, we'll also have the Vera Rubin telescope. We'll have potentially the ELT telescope. So we'll have some enormous telescopes capable of doing very detailed observations on distant objects. And you only have to look at some of the images from the ground of Saturn and Jupiter in the last few years that are rivaling pretty much what the Hubble's been able to deliver, but the Hubble's still, delivering incredible images. And let's not count the Hubble out. The Hubble could still be operational by then, depending on gyros and computers and what have you. Who knows? So let's see. I don't think, Alex, it's going to be that good at taking images over that kind of distance. It's like you look at New Horizons or you look at Voyager even, and when Voyager spun around to do its kind of mosaic of the solar system, the famous pale blue dot image that Carl Sagan had kind of pushed through to have done. The images of all the planets, even the ones closest to it, were just pixels. They were single pixels. There was nothing there. The Earth was almost a sub-pixel. And a comet 300 kilometers across at those kind of distances, with the imaging systems and the optics that are going to be on board the Lucy mission, which is more optimized for close approach, near field imaging, probably won't be able to do much. So great question, though. Thanks for that, Alex. Let's rock on, because like I said, we've got so much to go through. Another one, Terry, I know you're a big fan of the Chinese space program.
Yeah, particularly when we think about the ISS having a limited lifetime, they keep talking about, what is going to happen. They can't go on funding it, and it's going to be expensive to maintain. And there's no plans at the moment to have a replacement for the ISS itself. So it could be that China will be the only country that has a functioning space station in low Earth orbit, say in the next decade. The ISS may continue then, but there's certainly a huge debate about the amount of funding. So China, we don't know everything about their space program, and we've talked a couple of times about it. They have a very high success ratio in almost all their missions. The last time we talked about was one of their rare failures. At the moment, their space station is only about, a tenth of the size of the ISS, but it's just starting. The ISS started off as a relatively small collection of modules. And China could well be the country that is doing most in terms of experiments in low and zero gravity in the low Earth orbit in the 1930s and beyond. They don't tell us exactly what their long-term plans are. In a way, there's a bit of karma in this, in that the Americans won't allow the Chinese up to the ISS. It remains to be seen whether the Chinese will open up their space station to any other country, or perhaps every other country except America. But that's getting into geopolitics, which I don't want to go into. But yeah, they are basically catching up very quickly with what NASA and ESA have been doing with the ISS. And as they say, watch this space.
I don't think it's going to be as large as the ISS, long-term goal. I think China have got some incredible plans. In terms of who they're going to allow on board, it's interesting going back to the Russian story. The Russians obviously had a massive loss in revenue with the introduction of SpaceX and their ability to very, very cheaply now deliver astronauts to the ISS via their missions. And Boeing, if they ever get the CST-100 working, that's another option. So the Russians have now basically opened up their commercial space tourism thing again, and there's some Japanese astronauts apparently scheduled to fly on the Soyuz up to the ISS. So it'll be interesting to see what China do. China are far more enclosed. We don't want to get into the geopolitics, but they're far more secretive, much like the Russians were when they were the Soviet Union back in the 60s and 70s. You wouldn't really hear about what happened with the missions until they succeeded or they were kind of working. Interestingly, also in the last week, there's been, and it's not rumors, it's fact, China have been doing some very advanced weapons testing in terms of their space program. And, there's talk all over various newspapers about hypersonic missiles. And it's something that, my company, I work in the defense side of space, and it's a real issue. The Russians and the Chinese and various other nations are testing hypersonic weapons, which basically launches as rockets, as it were, go into low Earth orbit, come out of low Earth orbit, and then are very high velocity missile systems, much faster than anything else. So whilst China in one respect are doing remarkable work, their work on Mars, their work on the moon, their work with a space station, it's great. It would just be fantastic if everyone could kind of just step back a little bit. And going back to the William Shatner thing, just see the Earth for what it is and see the beauty of the Earth and not be this constant kind of bun fight, as it were. But anyway, we wish the Chinese extremely well. Some of the lunar samples that they brought back, there's some great science coming out of those already in terms of evidence of volcanic activity, etc. So let's just hope that the scientific aspects of what we talk about really does come to the fore, and it doesn't just descend into sending up people on jollies and fighting in space, that we get some real science from it. And that's what we're hoping from the James Webb, etc. Anyway, moving on to our next story. If this happens, we won't be getting any science from space. So the last week or so, we had quite a large geomagnetic storm. So we've got various spacecraft. One of them is currently having a bit of a problem, but we'll talk about that possibly in another show. But we've got various spacecraft that are at different Lagrange points, basically looking at the sun. So we've got spacecraft like the Parker Solar Probe, very close proximity to the sun, looking at the solar dynamics and looking at what's creating, various magnetic effects, etc., on the solar surface, as it were. But we've also got lots of spacecraft looking at what's happening, and they give us an early warning system now, which we never used to have. So what we have with the sun is a variable level of activity over 11-year period. Typically, you'll get a kind of increase and decrease in sunspot activity. We've had a very quiescent sun for the last, God knows how long, quite a long time now, where almost no sunspot activity. Now we're seeing some, but we're also seeing an increase in solar flare activity. Now, if you go on YouTube or Google and have a look at some of these solar flares, they are literally huge. They are millions of miles in length, some of them. I mean, some of the average prominences and flares that I've been imaging from my back garden using specialized telescopes, are the distance from the Earth to the moon, and they're not even that big. So when one of these things comes our way, we need to know about it. Now, why do we need to know about it? Well, in the mid-1800s, there was an event known as the Carrington event, which was observed by a British astronomer named Carrington, who basically saw pretty much the only white light flare pretty much seen in history. Observing with a telescope, at those days, you didn't have some of the advanced hydrogen alpha and calcium K line telescopes that we have now. Even amateurs have those. So observing with his naked eye, he saw this incredible kind of explosive event on the solar surface. And then at the time, the only major electrical systems on Earth were the telegraph wires, and they were going mental. They were going nuts. Telegraph wires continuing to tap Morse code for hours, sparking, all sorts of things. We then, we've had multiple events over the years. We had one in the late 80s, which knocked out power stations in Canada, etc. These solar storms are becoming more and more of a problem. The reason they're becoming more and more of a problem was because we are more and more reliant on space for our infrastructure. So, you look at Starlink, for example, in terms of the internet. If, as is reported now, North America, lots of people in North America are thinking we're going to switch to Starlink for our internet. Great. Okay. If a massive solar storm occurs, the impact on a lot of low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, high Earth, geosynchronous orbit satellites could be catastrophic. Nobody knows what's going to happen if one of these high X class, so they're kind of measured in these X numbers. If one of these high X class events were to strike the Earth really head on, if it can take out power substations on the Earth's surface, what can it do to small form factor satellites? Some of these small CubeSats and things like Starlink, which is about the size of a fridge, they're not particularly well shielded. They can shut them down, they could rotate them, there's all sorts of aversion methods that the ground controllers could take. But if you've got, potentially 100,000 active satellites between China, Starlink, Amazon, Russia, whoever else, and there was a report this week of, I forgot which nation it was, we're talking about literally tens of thousands of satellites that they were trying to get a license for. If that happens, the implications are literally huge. They're catastrophic. The UK government and the Ministry of Defence have wargamed this as a scenario because this is such a significant threat. So we've got to keep an eye out for these solar storms. They're beautiful to watch if you've got the ability, either online, and there's lots of websites that let you look at the sun in various frequencies. Watch them. They are spectacular when they happen. And they really put the Earth and everything else into context. You look at some of the images of the Earth to scale that have been kind of composited in to these solar images. We're just a dot. You could swallow the Earth 1 million times inside the sun. This is the thing that we get, and the sun's not even a big star. But if one of these were to occur, it's going to be bad. Beautiful aurora, don't get me wrong. You'll be able to see the aurora as far south as Spain. But do we want this to happen? I don't know. Terry, thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. Even sort of never mind what's up in space. If the Carrington event were to happen today, it would wipe out an awful lot of the major electrical structure here on Earth in terms of the transmission systems. It would blow out big transformers and so on. You wouldn't want your computer still to be connected to a power supply. If something like that happened, I'd say it could get pretty well scrambled. But certainly, yes, since we rely so much now on space for everything from sat-nav to weather to navigation and by ships and planes and so on, international banking, all the transactions go via satellites all around the world. It would just be total and utter chaos. And as you say, we really do need to be prepared for this. If we get one with very little warning in the next year or two, I dread to think what the consequences would be. Well, but maximum isn't due, and we don't know just what the next solar maximum is going to be like. But whatever it is, it's probably not going to be at maximum for another 3 to 4 years. So we have a bit of time to try and do something about it.
But at the same time, Terry, we're sticking up more and more satellites. It's more and more of a problem. So it's like I said, it's almost been, you've been looking at the sun as well. It's almost been like a mini Maunder minimum for the last 10 years. There's been nothing happening on the sun surface, pretty much, so to speak, unless you've got one of these specialized telescopes looking really close. But it's worrying times, shall we say. Yep. Anyway, moving on to our next story, a little bit closer to home. This is another good one that Terry's found.
Yep. I mentioned earlier about the Chinese space program and their successes, and this is a result of one of them. They were the first to land a spacecraft on the far side of the moon, but this is actually one that they landed on the near side, but they did it in an area which had not been explored by any of the Surveyor or Apollo landings before, on the edge of what's called the Oceanus Procellarum, or the Ocean of Storms. Not an ocean, of course, at all. except in the sense that it's a huge sea, if you like, of solidified lava. It was molten at one stage, but it's certainly not an ocean or a sea like anything we have on the Earth. And the reason they went there is that by studying the spectrum, basically, of the light reflected from the lunar surface, they concluded that this was a rather different area to the other parts of the moon from which we actually had samples. So it was near a mountain, or mountain isn't quite the right word, a large mound, a large raised area called Mons Rumker, which you can actually see in a moderate telescope from Earth when the lighting's right. It needs to be pretty near full moon to see it properly. It's quite a large area. They landed beside it, and indeed what they found was that the samples of rock which they retrieved and brought back were actually quite different from all the other lunar samples. And in particular, it shows that the volcanism on the moon lasted for about a billion years longer than we originally thought. The moon, going back to the very beginning, is thought to have formed whenever a giant Mars-sized body collided with the Earth way back in the very early history of the solar system, about 4.5 billion years ago. A glancing blow and blasted a lot of material off into space, some of which condensed to form the moon, some of which came back to Earth and formed part of what we have as the Earth, and the rest we don't really know about. I'm always fascinated by what happened to Theia, which is the name given to this theoretical body. This is all theory, of course. We don't have any direct evidence for it, but all the computer simulations seem to show that this is what happened. So Theia would have been about the mass of Mars, which is approximately 1/10 of the mass of the Earth. The moon is only 1/80th, roughly, of the mass of the Earth. So what happened to the rest? So if it didn't all come back down to Earth, where is it? That's one thing that fascinates me. But anyway, back to the moon itself. Following that, when the moon condensed out of this debris that had been blasted off the surface of the Earth and part of Theia itself, there was what was called the late heavy bombardment, when basically asteroids of various sizes in the early solar system were still bombarding with probably the Earth as well, and Venus and Mars, but particularly the evidence is there on the moon. And the large circular mare that we see, the seas like the Mare Serenitatis, the Oceanus Procellarum, the Mare Humorum, and so on, are basically the scars of these impacts where bodies penetrated right into the moon, released the molten magma from inside, and came up onto the surface. We didn't know when that came to an end. From all the Apollo samples that we got and other samples brought back by Russian missions, the latest evidence, or the evidence for the latest activity of that sort of volcanic activity, to call it that in terms of molten lava, was about 3 billion years ago. This has now added about an extra billion years to that. So we know that there was molten lava on the surface of the moon only about 2 billion years ago instead of about 3 billion years ago. Now, this is pretty good going. They only brought back about, 1.6, 1.7 kilograms of material, but it was obtained from the surface and from down to about 1 meter below the surface from a drill. And the Chinese Academy of Sciences have been studying it, and this is the conclusion. So it's taught us something, not only about the moon itself, but the history of this part of the solar system. Because when you think about it, whatever was happening to the moon a couple of billion years ago was also happening to the Earth in terms of impacts from cosmic bodies. So we're learning all the time, and this is something where there'll probably be even more information coming out as they study them more. Interesting thing is that while they, from the spectral analysis of the surface of this area of the moon on the edge of the Oceanus Procellarum, there are a lot of radioactive elements there higher than in other areas, elements like thorium and uranium. They found actually that the rock samples that they brought back were not particularly enriched in those radioactive elements. So that is not the reason for that area remaining molten for longer than they expected. So there's still a lot more work to be done. And remember, this is our nearest neighbor in space, and we still have an awful lot to learn about it. Over to you, Nick.
Well, don't forget as well, when the moon formed, I mean, all of the theories suggested the moon formed a lot closer in terms of its position relative to the Earth. So up to however, and don't forget, it's only moving away at about the rate of your fingernail growth per year. So it's like that much per year. It's not space 1999, as it were. You've got tidal interactions. You remember in the early days of the Earth, you've got massive amounts of volcanism occurring on the Earth's surface as well. Plus, you're going to have this tidal interaction between the moon and the Earth. So keeping the interior of the moon possibly in a more fluid state, that could be one knock-on effect from that as well. Also, there's the whole theory of Jupiter's motions through the early solar system and what that was doing in terms of, perturbations of gravitation, gravitational perturbations of the inner solar system bodies, etc. Then we've also got the galaxy rotation, and we've got this 250 million year rotation of our solar system around the galaxy, and it dipping up and down through the galactic plane, and the interactions with other bodies in the galaxy that potentially have caused things like increases in bombardments from the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud, etc. When we interact with other bodies in a relatively close proximity, maybe a light year or so, the gravitational perturbations of those can start flinging in comets and asteroids into the inner solar system as well due to gravitational perturbation. And we've had multiple mass extinctions. I was listening to a program the other day talking about the 5 main mass extinctions that we've had during the Earth's kind of lifespan, and the fact that sometimes we've become almost an ice ball, and then the one that occurred about 500 million years ago wiped out 95% of all life on the planet. So if you think the one at the KT boundary was bad with the dinosaurs, that was even worse. So it is very, very interesting. Plus, I think once we really do set up a base on the moon again and get back to the moon properly, some of the work that's been done, even in UK universities on the Apollo samples, and I know people who've worked on this, where they've been looking at, what's been happening to the moon's surface over the multi-billion years that it's been orbiting around our galaxy, and the interactions there, unlike the Earth, we've got weathering and we've got plate tectonics, etc., which basically wipe out a lot of these really ancient records. So maybe we will find evidence of Theia once we start going back to the moon proper and drilling really deep into it and looking at more of the lunar surface. It's the most fascinating thing for me. It's the most annoying thing when it comes to astronomy and imaging, because it's a pain. But in terms of a body, I just absolutely love the moon. I've got an obsession with the moon. We've got a lot going on in the chat. I'm going to go to another one of the questions here. So Ground-Based Space has said, how do we prepare? Now, this goes back to our story about solar storms. The answer to that is we don't. We can't really prepare. What we can do is rely on these early warning systems, these satellites that we have, orbiting the sun, that will give us this heads up that effectively then, if there is a Carrington scale event, it may give some of the satellite operators time to shut down, non-critical systems, keep the satellites almost in a sleep mode, if that's part of it. In terms of the ground stations, it may be a case that we just shut down the power until it's passed. I mean, as Terry said, something as simple as having something plugged into the mains, you could end up blowing up your TV, your laptop, whatever. So how do we prepare? We've got to rely on the early warning systems. There's nothing we can do in terms of, it's not going to irradiate us, it's not going to kill us in that respect, but it is going to cause havoc. The estimations were in the trillions of dollars in terms of the economic impact of one of these massive solar events. So it's just a case of, if something occurs in the news and we are given, even if it's just a few hours warning, making sure that, the UK's infrastructure, the global infrastructure, that substations, power stations can be shut down, that people know that something's going on. And we've proven with COVID that as a planet, we can come together scientifically and show resilience. So let's just hope. We're running a little low on time, so I'm going to skip on nicely to our next story just very quickly. This is a cracker because I've got loads of these behind me in the cabinet. Meteorites, I love meteorites. And occasionally we get hit by about 36,500 tons of meteoritic material per year, this planet. So it's not insignificant. Some years it's more. Chelyabinsk in 2013, massive meteorite, exploded 17 meters wide, showered the whole of northern Siberia with tiny little micrometeorites. Some of them in the cabinet behind me. Occasionally they hit things, and when they hit like things that we've constructed, they turn into what's called hammerstone. So a meteor, before it hits the ground, once it hits the ground, it's a meteorite. If it hits something like a barn or a shed or a house or whatever, they tend to be called hammerstones. There's some really famous examples. One hit a car, basically a rubbishy old $400 car. The car sold for $75,000 after it'd been hit by a meteorite. So meteorites are literally gold from space. In the last week or so, some lady in Canada basically was asleep in a bed about 10 to midnight, and I think it's October the 3rd in British Columbia, so BC, really beautiful part of Canada, and she woke up with a meteorite next to her on the bed. So basically this thing had crashed through her house, crashed through the ceiling, and landed within inches of her, and had it hit it, probably could have killed her. I mean, you don't want to be hit by a meteorite. We don't know of anyone that's been killed by a meteorite officially. We know that potentially a dog was hit by the Napier meteorite in the early 1900s, which is one of the kind of, is it famous, is it apocryphal stories? There's been some other examples. There was a lady in the 1950s that a meteorite crashed through her roof, bounced off something in her living room and bruised her on her leg. We've had famously in the last few months anyway, the Winchcombe meteorite, which is a rare carbonaceous chondrite meteorite in the UK, which hit somebody's driveway. Again, just a few feet the other way, it would have crashed straight through the roof of the house. So it's one of those things that they come all the time. They can happen. As I said, 36,500 tons, some of it with the kinetic energy of an atomic bomb. Thankfully, 71% of the Earth is covered in water, so most of it blasts over the oceans and they're high air bursts, and we don't really notice them that much. But it's interesting now looking at the UK Meteorite Monitoring Network and the UK meteor cameras, and lots of people have got meteorite cameras and meteor cameras, meteor cameras, and they're looking up with these all-sky cameras and being able to look at the trajectories and then triangulate the positions. So we're finding more of these meteorites now based upon that kind of data. And I think this is really interesting because there was evidence that there had been a meteorite shower in the skies above Western Canada that night. Some of these cameras had picked up these events. Thankfully, the lady wasn't injured, but yeah, it's about 1.5 kilos. So 1.5 kilos hitting you at terminal velocity, it's going to hurt at the very best. It could potentially, it landed just literally inches away from her head. It's a fun story. It's one of those and finally type stories that you get on the UK news. I don't know what you think about this, Terry, but I just thought it was a corker.
Yeah, you mentioned something there that's very important. A lot of people think that a meteorite landing on Earth is going to be coming in with the sort of velocity it has in space, which is kilometers per second. But that is not the case unless it's so big that it doesn't really matter. It's going to kill everything anyway. Yeah. Basically, they come in at speeds of 40, 50, 60, 70 kilometers per second, and they are slowed down by the Earth's atmosphere at varying heights, depending on just how big they are and how fast they're going. But basically, when you see a meteorite, even a really brilliant one like the Chelyabinsk one, you're only seeing it when it is traveling at this very, very high velocity and vaporizing, or strictly speaking, not vaporizing, ionizing the air as it's passing through. When it slows down to roughly the speed of an aeroplane, basically, it no longer shines. It becomes invisible, even in daytime, because it's still, 5, 10, 15 miles up, and it's the size of, from a loaf of bread up to the size of a fridge or whatever size the object is. From then on, it is dropping just at what you call terminal velocity. So it's as if you dropped a rock out of an aeroplane. Depending on the size and the density and so on, it will travel at a few hundred miles an hour, which is certainly enough to give you a very bad headache. But it won't be coming in with cosmic velocity unless, as I say, it is so big that the atmosphere has not slowed it down. And in that case, it's goodnight Irene anyway. Yeah. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing to think that something like this can literally land on the bed beside you.
And the nice thing is, hopefully this lady said she's going to keep it. It's going to be staggeringly valuable. So if she ever wants a retirement fund, unlike what happened at Winchcombe, where basically they, kindly or whatever gave it all away into science, which is fantastic from a scientific research perspective, but that was a very valuable meteorite there. So hopefully this lady will, do something similar and give some of it to science, but keep some of it. It'd be really nice. It'd be a fantastic keepsake to have on your mantelpiece and say, that nearly hit me at some point in the future. Anyway, our final roundup. We're going to talk about what's happening in the sky. Jupiter's still up there, Terry. So Saturn. What else have we got?
I'm going to concentrate this time on the two innermost planets, Venus. Now, from where I live, it is extremely hard to see. But if you're in the southern part of these islands and you look low in the southwest after sunset in the twilight, you can see a very bright twinkling object. It twinkles. Doesn't normally twinkle that much, but when it's very low down, it can. And that is Venus, the planet that is next to us as we go in towards the sun. The brightest object in the night sky, apart from the moon. It's called variously the evening star when it's visible in the evening, or the morning star when it's visible in the morning. At the moment, you can just see it. It's not a particularly good operation because of the angle of the ecliptic to the horizon in our latitudes. If you're much further south, you see it more easily. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's actually very, very good, but you can see it. If you're in northern Scotland, I would say don't really bother. It's going to be too low down for you. So that's the next planet as we go in towards the sun. The innermost one, Mercury, is actually visible in the mornings, and this is quite a good apparition. It's not easy to see because it never moves very far out from the sun, and therefore it's only ever visible in twilight. You can never see it in a totally dark sky. So if you look low in the southeast in the mornings, starting, say, about 50 minutes before your local sunrise, and that will depend where you are in these islands to get that time, but you can find that out easily enough. Look for a bright object in the twilight. If you have binoculars, that'll make it an awful lot easier. It's visible up to about roughly half an hour before sunrise, then the sky starts to get too bright. But from now on, up for basically for the next 2 weeks, it's fairly faint at the moment, but still bright enough to see. It will be getting brighter and brighter for the next week, 10 days or so. And two dates to look out for. On the 1st of November, it'll be about 4 degrees above and left of the bright star Spica in Virgo. Nearly had a mental blank there for a moment. And it'll be very interesting to compare the color of Mercury, which is often described as slightly pinkish, with the blue-white of Spica. And then on the 3rd of November, the waning crescent moon will lie just about 6 degrees above and to the right of Mercury. So if you've never seen Mercury, that is a particularly good time to look out for it. There's one other thing I want to mention. There's one of the major meteor showers in terms of sort of being in the top 10, but not in the top 5, reaching maximum in the next couple of days. The Orionids, they appear to come from the north east corner of Orion, basically a bit above and to the left of Betelgeuse as we see it. It's quite a good shower, 20 or so meters per hour, visible in good conditions. Unfortunately, for this year, the moon is almost full, but while the maximum is on the 22nd of October, you can still see some tonight and the next couple of nights. And if you go out and get the moon somewhere out of the sky where it's not actually shining in your eyes, by making sure that you position yourself where it's behind the gable of the house or behind a tree or something like that, so it's not shining directly into your eyes, and look up in that general direction, you may see some of these Orionid meteors. The interesting thing is they're parts of Comet Halley, the best known comet of all. We happen to be passing through its orbit basically over at this time of year, and these are bits of debris from Comet Halley that has been left behind as it orbits around the sun. At their best, they're very good. They're very swift. Quite a number of them leave bright trains. Not ideal this year, but nevertheless worth having a look out, especially over the next day or two before the moon gets too obtrusive. So those are the highlights for the sky at the moment. And as you say, Jupiter and Saturn are still there. Get them if you can, if you have a telescope, before they disappear.
Fabulous. Got a couple of final questions. Freddie has come up with one. Can you see Mercury with binoculars in Gloucestershire? Yes.
Yep.
I mean, I'm in Wiltshire, so just a bit south of you, Freddie. Yes, you definitely can. But as Terry was saying before, obviously it's in the morning sky, so it means getting up quite early, and basically make sure that as soon as it's sunrise, don't start looking anymore with binoculars or whatever. Obviously, it can be extremely dangerous looking anywhere near the sun. And with binoculars, because you've got such a wide field of view, you could easily sweep across the sun. And even a low sun, a split second with binoculars, it could be catastrophic. So just bear that in mind. But yes, you can definitely see it. And Ground-Based Space has said, yeah, wouldn't recommend it tonight if you're anywhere near Oxfordshire. Yeah, again, I'm in Wiltshire. The weather's not playing ball at the moment, Terry, for us in the UK. We've had a few really good weeks actually of quite nice skies and quite decent weather. So I'm hoping that over the winter, because obviously we're coming out of pandemic, etc., and we're now heading into quite a gloomy winter economically and various other things, that we're going to have some really nice clear nights and really quite good skies to look forward to.
Nick, just to say, I can't see those questions on my screen, so I'm relying on you to pick them out.
Fine. That's right.
Yeah,
that's fine.
right.
Pop up. Final plug. Talking about meteorites before, we're wearing the amazing Space Store Carbonaceous Chondrite t-shirts. If you want one, you can get one. These are really great. They're actually really, really good. I've said this before. I get given loads and loads of free stuff from various space companies. These are actually really nice and comfy. So cracking little t-shirt. Space Store obviously do some great stuff. Got some great outreach. They're open again now. Obviously, post lockdown for VR and stuff. They have supported us so much, and just a massive thank you again, as always, to those guys. Thanks so much for all the comments and the chat. It really means a lot to us, to people who are enjoying the show. So thank you all so much, and we'll hopefully see you again in 2 weeks' time. We'll just hand you back to Latch now, and adios.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much for another great show. Nick and Terry, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. And thanks to our wonderful, engaging audience tonight. Thanks, Freddie. Thanks, Ground-Based Space, once again. Nice of you, Paul, to join in. Sane Alex, thanks for joining in. Remember, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please do help the growing space community here on Space Still Live. And a big special thanks to Nick and Terry for bringing us another great roundup. If you don't follow us on social media, please go ahead and follow us: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever you want. And we'll be posting some fun snippets of tonight's show on social media. If you've missed anything, if you've missed any previous roundups, remember you can catch up on the channel. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time on the 2nd of November with more space news. All right, take care, guys. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.
Cheers.
All right.
Take it easy.
Watch this
Bye.
space.
Watch this space.
Hi, my name's Nick Howes, space enthusiast, author, writer, broadcaster.
Hi, I'm Terry Mosley, past president of the Irish Astronomical Association, lifelong astronomy and space nerd, absolutely fascinated by everything, both man-made and natural up there.
So every 2 weeks, Terry and I give you the latest, hottest news from space and human spaceflight, robotic spaceflight, and what's happening up in the skies. Please tune in to us every fortnight with the Space Store.